Good evening. Welcome to New Horizons. If you do have a mobile phone, if you'd like to put it on silent, please, thank you. Right, absolutely massive welcome back to Ian Crane with Humanity versus Insanity, the fight back. Veteran of the anti-fracking opposition, long-term resident of the Barton Moss protest camp and regular presenter on the UK column. Ian highlights the corporate agenda being foisted upon us in ever-increasing ways. Large corporations are for profit first, everything else second. On target tonight, the now fashionable zero contracts in the employment sector, benefits, if that's the right word, and debt. Also a possible solution, if enough of us are willing to re-educate and stand up. That's work, by the way. Ian's website is all the W's, ianrcrane.com. So please welcome the man himself, Ian Crane.
Good evening, welcome. And I was saying to Jasmine here earlier that I've spoken at New Horizons, I think more often than I've spoken at any other venue around the UK. I think the first time I spoke here was almost 9 years ago in September of 2005. But actually today was the first time I've ever had to find my own way here. And so after coming here for 8 years, I've discovered tonight that Lytham and St Anne's are two different places. Needless to say, I went to the wrong one. Anyway, before I kick off, some of you have spoken to me tonight about the forthcoming event in 2.5 weeks' time. Humanity versus Insanity, same title as my talk tonight. This is Alternative View 5. Obviously by the name you can work out that we've had four previous events. The last one of which was actually 4 years ago. So this is the first event for 4 years. This is right in the heart of the country. It's at Daventry. It is a residential weekend. And what we're doing is bringing together who, in my opinion, are some of the most outstanding commentators on what is unfolding right now. And the whole idea of having the weekend is so that it's not just a case of a speaker gets up on the platform and then walks off. The speakers are going to be there for the whole weekend as well, so people can have a chat with them over breakfast, lunch, dinner, whatever, in the bar in the evening. But the whole idea is that it's more than just a conference. The whole idea is that people go away from this event motivated to actually do something. Because that's really the critical factor right now. As I'm sure you're already aware, I know I'm preaching to the converted, as it were, but what is happening right now just cannot continue. It cannot be sustained. And as I'm going to show you this evening, those who think they're the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom have one agenda, and they're working on the basis that our apathy is so great that even though we can see the direction in which they're moving this agenda, we won't actually be able to react against it. And that's our challenge. So we are very much in a space of humanity versus insanity. And on that note, right now, I'm actually bilocating, because at this very moment, I'm actually going out live on the UK column channel with the show by the same name of Humanity versus Insanity. Anybody seen this show online? Yeah. Oh, about 3. That's about right. So Google aren't messing with the figures then. It really is just 3. I started doing Humanity versus Insanity at the beginning of the year because, as many of you will know, for 2013, I focused entirely on the issue of hydraulic fracturing, of fracking. And in fact, the first of my Fractured Future talks, which I did 94 last year around the country, I did here in New Horizons on February the 11th last year. 2 weeks after I met with the Quadrilla management team up at the Caravan Club. So there was a lot of people saying, Ian, you know, appreciate all the work you're doing on fracking, but what about all the other stuff that you've been talking about? You know, we need an update on those issues. Well, you know, I'm still going to focus on the fracking because, as you'll see as we go through the evening, I mean, that has to be an absolute priority. Not to the detriment of everything else, but it has to be a priority. Because, especially in this area, but I mean, if we don't nail this, if we don't nail the hydraulic fracturing issue, then I would argue that almost everything else is an irrelevance. Yeah, so it's a critical factor. And as we'll talk about later on in the evening, we have a very, very narrow window of opportunity to absolutely nail it. So anyway, not to leave the fracking issue out of it, so I have the second show, which I've actually been doing a little bit longer, called Fracking Nightmare, which has been going out since the end of last October. Actually, I know that the vast majority of people who watch, or who have been watching Fracking Nightmare, are the Greater Manchester Police, particularly the TAU. And for those of you that were here a little earlier, the film that I was showing was one of the videos that I recorded of escorting the convoys. And it's great to see a number of Barton Moss veterans here. Darren, Nikki, Sammy, yeah. I see you're not at Upton Holiday Camp then. Not yet. Okay. So yes, the Greater Manchester Police and Quadrilla and IGAS, because they want to find out, what our current thoughts are on the issue. But we know that YouTube doctor the numbers of anything that's put up that goes somewhat against the establishment, because we've actually seen the YouTube numbers go down. So we have no real idea how many people are watching these programs. But the key element is it doesn't matter whether it's one or two in the community dotted around the country, because what we're doing right now is still sowing the seeds. You guys here have been on the front line of this issue for quite some time with Quadrilla, ever since the Earth moved, as it were. The seismic events that occurred in April and May of 2011. So you guys are very much in the front line, and of course Quadrilla are trying to get their bits back in the ground here. But by the end of this year, 64% of this country will be up for grabs. And at that point, I don't care whether people refer to it as NIMBYism. 64% of the country, though, with NIMBYs, gives us a great chance of shutting this down. So even if it takes until the fracking companies try and get in those areas, nonetheless, it's certainly not too late. So these shows are going out tonight. We've had a 3-week break. So the Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report, goes out at 7:30 on a Monday night, and Fracking Nightmare goes out at 9 o'clock on the UK column channel. But the following day, they are up on YouTube, so if you want to catch some of the back issues there, you can find them on YouTube. So, Humanity versus Insanity, and I know the person who put this banner up is here tonight. Isn't that right? Yeah? Steve. And I wasn't actually at Barton Moss on this particular day, but, I'd had it in my head that maybe I should sort of get a banner that says Fracking Nightmare or Humanity versus Insanity, but there was just so much else going on, I never got around to it. So thanks, Steve, for taking that initiative. So tonight, I'm not going to focus on fracking per se, because I did that a year ago. But if you haven't seen my presentation on fracking, and you live sort of in the Preston area or somewhere over that way, I am actually giving a new talk called To Be or Not To Be Totally Fracked at Congleton Town Hall on Thursday. Now, there are an increasing number of frack-free groups around the country. And in the Fylde Peninsula, how many do you have now? Is it about 10, 12? The local groups, the village groups? 13. I mean, this is amazing. This is exactly, what we need to see. Because Quadrilla and the other companies, they can't handle these multiple groups. What they want to see is some umbrella group, so they only have to talk to one person. No, you've got to talk to 13 at least.
133 around the country.
133, okay. This is fantastic. Hopefully in a year's time, it'll be 10 times that. That's what we need. Small communities that operate totally autonomously. Now, in my talks, though, I try to do them separate from the frack-free groups. Because if something is advertised as frack-free, it pretty much gives it away. it pretty much gives away that what you're going to see is a talk that is anti-fracking. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to reach out to the people that are still sitting on the fence, or actually are pro-fracking. Yeah, because otherwise I'm just literally sharing more information with people who've already made their mind up. And our challenge, this is our real challenge, is to reach out to those people who are still undecided. So I was speaking at an event on Saturday in Sussex, and one of the speakers was actually the guy who advised the landowner in Borkham that to embrace the hydraulic fracturing agenda, to invite Quadrilla effectively to take a 25-year lease on his land, was one of the speakers. And it was a real tough order to actually keep my mouth shut for the 20 minutes that he was speaking. But in the end, he made one final statement. I just had to say, I'm sorry, that is fundamentally untrue. And in the afternoon, I just ripped apart everything that he had said. But it was an education to see the magnitude of the cognitive dissonance that the apologists for this abomination present. So, you've got to know what they're thinking to be able to counter it. So anyway, that's Congleton Town Hall in southeastern Cheshire on Thursday night, 7:30. So tonight, humanity versus insanity. I don't think there's probably anybody in the room, you wouldn't be here otherwise, if you thought that everything was going as it should be. And those who think they are the rightful rulers of this planetary fiefdom have got their henchmen once again trying to drag the world into war. And funnily enough, it's primarily the same tools that they were trying to use 9 months ago over Syria. So, of course, you will have seen these two individuals, John Kerry and William Hague. Now, there's something I want to share with you about William Hague, if you're not already aware. And what I'm going to share with you is a matter of public record. William Hague became a warmonger shortly after he was presented with a set of photographs which show him in a rather unfortunate location in London at 2 o'clock in the morning with his parliamentary advisor in tow. This is the same parliamentary advisor with whom he was saving public funds by sharing a hotel room with. And I'm not sure that Fionn was aware of that arrangement, but we know this as a matter of absolute fact because the journalist who goes by the name of Guido Fawkes, who actually has a column in that well-known epitome of the British press, The Sun, but he gave evidence under oath at the Leveson inquiry, and at the Leveson inquiry he recounted this incident, that he knew the parties involved and that he knew the party who was effectively given £25,000 by the Murdoch media to acquire this set of photographs. This set of photographs have never been published, but you know for sure that William Hague has seen them. And what we are seeing here is a man who will basically do whatever he is told for fear that those photographs make it into the public domain. Kerry, well, he's a member of Skull and Bones. As many of you remember, when he ran for the US presidency. And the fraternities in the US are historically constructed to ensure that people who get into positions of power in the industrial, military, government complex are effectively controllable. So there are two primary organizations in the US. One is Skull and Bones, which of course is directly associated with Yale. The other one is Scroll and Keys, which is directly associated with Harvard. And then they have another organization, which very few people have heard of, which effectively mops up everybody else. So in other words, anybody who goes to any other Ivy League university other than Yale or Harvard, but who is thought to have the appropriate qualities to be able to get into the industrial military complex or senior echelons of the industrial military complex are pulled into an organization known as Phi Beta Kappa. Now, Phi Beta Kappa is ostensibly a fraternity, but over the last 30, 40 years, obviously, there's been a few women in US society that have emerged as candidates to take senior leadership positions. So if they demonstrate that they have the appropriate levels of testosterone, then they are inducted into Phi Beta Kappa. And so it shouldn't surprise you that the likes of Hillary Clinton and Condoleezza Rice are both members of Phi Beta Kappa. So pretty much, it doesn't matter what name you come up with. You Google any name you like at a senior level within the industrial, military, political complex in the US. If they went to Yale, they will be members of Skull and Bones. If they went to Harvard, they will be Scroll and Keys. If they went anywhere else, they will be Phi Beta Kappa. That's pretty much a given. In this country, it's not so narrow. Of course, currently, the organization or the fraternity that has the ascendancy here is the Bullingdon Club. Yeah, the Bullingdon Club. So the likes of Cameron and Osborne and Boris Johnson are all members of the Bullingdon Club. Basically, these are the clubs that encompass Harrow, Eton, Oxford, Cambridge. That's why we have an inordinate amount of people at senior level in politics who are part of these organizations. No real surprise. And if you do manage, or anybody else manages to break in to this level, then they will be controlled in one way, shape, or form. So, not too far away from here right now, there's something unfolding around Rochdale. Big Cyril. Big Cyril. And Greater Manchester Police are going to conduct an investigation. Give me a break. I think we know the result of that already, don't we? No, Cyril, no. No, Cyril, no. Lot of rumour, but no hard evidence. Right. Well, this is part of the unravelling. One of the people that will be at AV5 has become a good friend of mine over the last 5 years. In fact, I first met him at AV2. He is still in the Metropolitan Police, but only just. He's actually told them now that he wants to resign, and they're getting a little bit worried. The reason they're worried is because 7 years ago, he was tasked with investigating systemic child abuse in care homes in the Metropolitan Police area of London. So over 2 years, he visited every single care home in the metropolitan area. And he was able to ascertain that there was indeed systemic abuse. And basically what was happening is that particularly on a Friday night, the young men and women in these homes, anything from sort of 12 upwards, they would disappear and they would be being looked after by members of the establishment over the weekend. So after 2 years, my friend wrote the report. He had a team, but they wrote the report. And he hadn't taken any vacation. He was on a mission. He was so motivated to get to the root of this and to get the investigation rolling to the next level. He wrote the report and he went away on vacation with his family. And when he came back, he said, Ian, I realised there was a problem because when I came back, there was somebody sitting in my office and I've never seen that much brass down at this level in the police. So he went into his office and he was obviously told to sit down. And they said, John, that report you wrote just before you went on holiday, that report doesn't exist. He said, I'm sorry? He said, no, that report doesn't exist. And then they gave him a script. And they said, if anybody asks you what you've been working on for the past 2 years, this is what you tell them you've been working on. Now, he has had to live with this for nearly 8, 9 years now. Yeah. And he has become more and more and more bitter, understandably. And, you know, I've said to him a number of times, I said, John, you know, you're more valuable inside than you are if you leave. But he's reached the point now where he just can't take it. He's struggling to actually motivate himself to go into work because, of course, having seen this, he now sees the magnitude of the corruption at every level. So it was about 10 days ago, he actually took the step to hand in his resignation, which is in the police is a complicated process. But he let it be known that he was basically intending to leave. So, of course, he was called to a meeting of some pretty senior police officers in the Metropolitan Police. And they said, well, John, you know, you've been in the force for 24 years or whatever. Why do you want to leave now? And, of course, he let them have both barrels. And he talked about all the work he'd done on the investigation and all the senior members of the establishment that he had effectively accumulated more than enough evidence to effectively initiate legal proceedings. And the names, I mean, it does pretty much all the names that you know, we're talking senior Tories, we're talking senior Labour, we're talking senior Lib Dems. In fact, as John said, you don't get into a senior level in politics unless they've got you right where they want you. I won't bore you with the gory details, but when you are initiated into Skull and Bones, they've got you. They've absolutely got you. From that moment forward, they own you. Of course, everybody at Harvard or Yale or Oxford or Cambridge, you know that if you get pulled into these fraternities, you will never want for anything materially. You will be very well taken care of materially. The only thing you have to do is sell your soul. And here's the guy, of course, who has sold his soul most cheaply. You know what? Every time I see this guy, I want to gag. I really want to gag. I mean, well, to even call this guy human is a real stretch. Let me give you an insight. I love this, by the way. This was a great capture, screen capture, wasn't it? This is Tony Blair on Sky News talking about how we've got to stand up to Putin, go launch an attack on him and send our remaining troops into another impossible conflict. I love this at the bottom. I mean, somebody has a sense of humour. Extremism warning. I mean, this guy is a sociopath of the highest order. And if anybody, I know some of you will have heard me tell you about this before, but this is the epitome of Blair's sociopathy. And this is a few years ago. This was actually during the Chilcot inquiry, which, of course, we're still waiting on the report, which is, by the way, probably never going to be published. And the reason that Chilcot won't publish the report is because the Cabinet Office, of course, is refusing to release the correspondence and the minutes of meetings between Blair and Bush in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Anyway, during the Chilcot inquiry, Blair had given evidence, and Andrew Marr was interviewing Tony Blair. Now, Andrew Marr is no paxman, but nonetheless, Andrew Marr can really gently push a point. And the question that Andrew Marr asked Blair, he said, so, Mr. Blair, he said, how do you actually sleep at night? Knowing that some 500,000 Iraqis, mainly civilians, have lost their lives as a result of an illegal war. And of course, Blair is sitting there, sort of like this. And then he responds by saying, Andrew, I think you'll find it was only 100,000. So that makes it all right then. I mean, you could see the look on Andrew Marr's face. And obviously he wanted to say something. which wouldn't have been very polite. But I think he was struggling to come to terms with the order of magnitude of what Blair had just said. That 100,000 Iraqi civilians was an acceptable price. These people, historically, have held human life in little value. They consider themselves to be a race apart. This guy isn't. He's a tool. He's not part of the inner sanctum, by any stretch of the imagination. He's simply carrying out their will. And he will do whatever it is he's told to do. He cares not that he's reviled. I had to smile when he made some comment about the public reaction to Margaret Thatcher's funeral. Because obviously there were many people amongst the British public who were somewhat less than impressed that she should get a state funeral, especially as many see her, perhaps rightly, as the architect, along with Reagan, of the start of the destruction of what we know or have known as Western society. He didn't like the idea that the public had reacted and not lined the streets. Well, you know what, I can't wait for this bastard to die. And you know what everybody needs to be doing? Getting this pile of shoes ready. You know? Pile of shoes, this is the Arabic insult. To take your shoe and throw your shoe. That's the Arabic insult. And I think when this guy does die, where I doubt he's going to be given a state funeral by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, it'll probably be very, very hush-hush, because I think people will know that the street will be lined with size 10s.
And 11s.
And 11s and 12s and every other. The belief system of those who think they are the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom is very, very different from anything that is in the public domain. You know, we're conditioned to have a belief system. The proletariat, the slaves. But these guys, well, the guys who control him, have a different belief system. And they actually believe that they have to share, they have to put out what their plans are. Because by putting out what their plans are, and then when there is no reaction, when there is public apathy, they take that as a mandate then to pursue their agenda. So, do you think it hasn't gone through my head many, many times that in sharing my insights as to what's going on here, I'm actually inadvertently helping them to achieve what they want to achieve? But what's the alternative? Because unless we do get people to realize what they're trying to do, how do we get people to actually get to the point where they're going to react? It's a real two-edged sword. The good news is, of course, that more and more people are starting to realize what's occurring. I mean, how many people have had random conversations over the last probably 2-3 years with random strangers, random people that you meet about what's occurring? Yeah? I mean, on my last trip up to Barton Moss, my car decided to die on me halfway at Cloud, and I had to rely on AA relay. Of course, I've discovered why it's called relay. You get 20 miles and another 20 miles. But actually, I didn't do too bad. I did get from Stroud to Barton Moss in 2 rides. But the first AA driver, this is quite late on Saturday evening, the first AA driver had his partner and daughter with him. And for an hour and a half, and they initiated the conversation. No, I didn't, because I don't initiate these kind of conversations, you know, unless there is a sort of window of opportunity. And they initiated it. And then when the second driver picked me up at Frankly Services, and he realized I was going to Barton Moss, and he said, "Are you part of the anti-fracking?" And so for the next 2 hours, we talked about fracking. You know, this is happening more and more. You know, we don't need the mainstream media. You know, we think it'd be nice if the mainstream media did actually help us by sharing this information, but actually we don't need the mainstream media. What's more important is that we resort or rely on the good old-fashioned word of mouth. I want to show you a piece of art that you may or may not have seen before. Anyone seen this before? A couple of you. Okay, this was actually, I can't remember the name of the artist off the top of my head, but this was actually Brick Lane in East London. And this is a little 18 months ago. And the reason he put this here, the New World Order is the enemy of humanity, because he painted the separated capstone, and people walking past going, you know, that's not funny, you know. That's not funny. Are you part of the New World Order? And he goes, no. He said, don't get ahead of me. Don't get ahead of me. He said, I haven't finished yet. He said, this is just the background. So he painted this, which wasn't part of the finished product, as you'll see in a second, but he painted this so that people actually knew that what he was doing was trying to raise awareness about the grip that the inner sanctum have on humanity. The finished product is very, very insightful. Very, very insightful. 2 years ago, I was giving a series of talks around the country talking about the global financial meltdown. And in those talks that I was giving, in fact, I started giving them in 2010, and was doing them right through until 2012, the last one being in December 2012 before I switched to the fracking issue. And I talked about the game of Monopoly in those talks. Has everybody here played Monopoly? Yeah. Has anybody ever finished a game of Monopoly? Yes? Okay, put your hand up if you finished a game of Monopoly. Okay, keep your hand up if you were the banker. Okay, now, can the people who finished the game of Monopoly and were the bankers keep their hand up? Right, keep your hand up if you won. See, I rest my case. Very few people actually get to finish a game of Monopoly. I mean, the ball comes out on Christmas Day, after lunch. Somebody has a bright idea to start the game of Monopoly. And it starts, and you go through the initial rounds of buying up the various properties around the board. And then when all the properties have been purchased, then you start the next round, which is to negotiate, because you need to acquire a full set. And then you start to buy a few houses and a few hotels. And then it's probably into Boxing Day by now, and everyone's getting a bit bored, and that's where the game ends. And so you simply total up who's got the most money and decide that's the winner. But of course, that's not the purpose of the game. The purpose of the game is for one person, the last man standing, to have total ownership of the board. Total ownership of everything. To bankrupt everybody else around the table. And 99 times out of 100, if the game actually goes through to completion, the person who has taken total ownership of the board is the banker. Not least because, obviously, it's only a game. But the banker, if the banker's running out of cash, you slip an extra couple of hundred when you go past go. When you win a chance or a community chest, win 150, you can't take 350. Just like real life, really, isn't it? And what this artist was trying to demonstrate was that the global banksters are literally riding on the backs of humanity. For those of you who haven't seen Humanity versus Insanity, the last program I did, we did, apart from tonight, we did I had a 3-week break, but I think it was episode 8. And in episode 8, I talk about the distribution of wealth on the planet. And I look at the distribution of wealth on a global basis, in the US, and in the UK. And in each case, the format is the same. People are asked what they think the wealth distribution is. Then they're asked what it should be. And then we show the reality. And nobody comprehends the reality. The reality is that less than 1% of the population on this planet owns 60% of the wealth of the planet. And that figure is getting greater all the time. And at the lower end, the number of people living in absolute abject poverty is increasing at a phenomenal rate. And of course, you know, we're seeing this all the time, aren't we? These are recent headlines: cuts pushing elderly care to the brink of disaster. People are being put into care because even if their children were motivated to look after their elderly parents, they can't. They can't, because they're having to work 2 or 3 jobs just to be able to sort of maintain enough of an income to keep a roof over their head and food on their table, let alone have one of them give up work to look after an elderly parent. So they're forced into nursing homes. And these nursing homes, of course, are run by the banksters, ultimately. And it's all about profit. So, you know, unfortunately, the stories that do get reported is just a very thin end of the wedge of the reality. I mean, it's almost creating a situation where people who have the misfortune to perhaps be infirm in their old age, but they're being pushed to the point where they're almost begging to be allowed to euthanize. Call it a hunch, but I'd say that's actually part of the game, part of the goal. At the other end of the spectrum, pupils too hungry to concentrate at school. And we saw recently the claim that some 3 million people are now using food banks. And of course the government says, oh no, that's an exaggeration. 3 million people using food banks.
Excuse me, but there's 2 more open grounds here.
Food banks?
Yes.
Well,
Church and 1 shop being converted into town square.
well, and unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, but we're going to see more of them. We have to see more of them. But what we're seeing, of course, is the supermarkets throwing away so much food, but they're not allowed, or their management prevent the local managers from distributing that waste food to the homeless or to the needy. You know, we produce more food on the planet than it would take to feed the 7 billion people, allegedly, on this planet. People aren't starving because there isn't enough food. They're starving because they can't afford it. And the corporations, the socio-psychopathic global corporatists, would rather dump food than give it away, because that then undermines their profitability. This is the obscenity that we're dealing with. You know, and we look at the causes of this, because obviously nothing is one-dimensional. You know, it's all a knock-on. But, I mean, we look at the outrageous employment situation in this country. You know, we see the right-wing media demonizing people that have to live on benefits. We see people who live on benefits being sanctioned because they're not applying for enough jobs. And I heard of a case recently where somebody had their benefits sanctioned, which meant that they were literally having to live on, like, you know, just a few pounds a week. And then they were taken to court because the benefits agency couldn't see how they could live on such a small amount of money, so therefore they must be committing benefits fraud. Fortunately, the outcome of that was fine, because the judge basically threw it out. But, you know, I think the name Atos was deliberately chosen. You know, the only thing they left off was the first couple of words, don't give. Sorry, I've got to explain that one. We are seeing at every level a deliberate game plan to destroy society. The other end of the other aspect of this, of course, is that we have more people in the British workforce earning minimum wage than at any time since records began. And a massive part of that, of course, is immigration. Now, before we go any further, I'm not a member of UKIP by any stretch of the imagination. And I have no problem with immigration, i.e. with immigrants, because, you know, if you're living in a country and you have an opportunity to better yourself or better the life of yourself and your family, you're going to take it. The problem is that we open our borders because we have been instructed to open those borders. And if anyone is in any doubt that this is part of the globalist agenda, look no further than an interview that Peter Sutherland, the former Irish Attorney General, who went to Brussels, he became the youngest ever EU Commissioner. He was given the task of negotiating the GATT agreements, the General Agreement on Trade Tariffs. He was considered to have done such an amazing job with that that he became the founding Director General of the World Trade Organization in 1994. He's one of the architects of something called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. And he gave an interview to the BBC on June the 21st, 2012, in which he stated that the globalist agenda was to destroy national homogeneity. And the primary way in which they were going to do it was through immigration. And this is why anybody who dares to challenge the immigration agenda is immediately labeled as a racist. This is how they shut down the debate. They shut down the discussion. So not only have we got a phenomenal percentage of the population on minimum wage, which is not a living wage by any stretch of the imagination, but then we have this other outrage called 0 hours contracts. Anybody here on a 0 hours contract? Well, that's a result. These are a total outrage. Basically, what it means is that you get offered a job, but they can't guarantee you any work. But you have to be at their beck and call 24/7. And because you've got a 0 hours contract with no guarantee of work, therefore no guarantee of income, so what people are doing is then going out and getting other 0 hours contracts to try and fill the gaps. And then what you get is, of course, it's like a bus, isn't it? You know, nothing comes along and then they all come along at once. And then, you know, I mean, I know of an example where somebody had 4 0 hours contracts and all 4 companies called the person, wanted them to work all on the same day. The person obviously chose one company. The other 3 fired her. Fired her from a 0 hours contract because she refused to go to work when they called her, despite the fact they knew that she had the other 0 hours contracts. The reason I know this story is true is because my daughter. And she became so frustrated that she is now in the 2nd year of studying midwifery. And she's going to be some whistleblower, I tell you. She's going to be a real whistleblower. So she's keeping everything sort of under wraps at the moment. But what she is seeing is that the health service, and particularly midwifery, is being wound down to the point where, you know, women, any woman who has even the slightest complication in the course of childbirth is now at risk. It's absurd, completely absurd. And guess what? It's a classic, isn't it? That, first of all, the fallout rate on the midwifery courses is 30% per year. So they're ending up with basically 10% after 3 years of what they started with. And even those that then qualify, they're doing the absolute bare minimum length of service with the NHS before they go into private practice. Because working for the NHS is just untenable. Every level of society. Now, what is remarkable is that people think this is random. this is just an unfortunate set of circumstances that have come about at this particular juncture. The reality is we can actually trace what is happening back at least 80 years. It could be further, but I'm only going to take it back to 1932. And there is a document that you can actually access, and this document was written by these two people, Marion King Hubbard and Howard Scott. Marion King Hubbard, some people have heard this guy's name because he is the guy who is attributed with first coming up with the idea of peak oil. Right? And I think I discussed that here 7 or 8 years ago. It's a myth. It's a myth. There is no such thing as peak oil, peak hydrocarbons. It's a construct. It's a construct to create the perception of artificial scarcity. Because when people believe that something is scarce, then subconsciously they're prepared to pay more for it. And what people still don't understand in this country is the amount of tax that's whacked onto hydrocarbons. So peak oil, as a semantic, might be correct, but actually it's peak hydrocarbons that is the real issue. There's no such thing. You know, they have an agenda. There's enough hydrocarbons on this planet to keep the world going for probably the next 500-600 years plus. The reality is, of course, we've never needed to use them, period. It's about corporatism. It's about control of the energy. Well, Marion King Hubbard came up with the concept of peak oil, and the global corporatists said, that's brilliant, that's absolutely brilliant, we'll milk that one. And so he was one of the founding members of the Club of Rome on the back of that. But back in 32, he was a student of this guy, Howard Scott. This guy was an engineer, and he was probably one of the original technocrats. In other words, that his philosophy was that you have to control humanity and treat humanity as a commodity. Now, that was 1932. The only problem was that in 1932, they didn't have the technology to be able to do it. So what they've been working on, and are still working on, is the technology to turn every single human into a commodity. Part of that process is calling you human resources. Human resources. A commodity. A commodity to be used, abused, and spat out. Pure collateral. Exactly. Let me just show you a few of the quotes from this book, Technocracy. I'll read it out to you because I know you can't see it at the back. Technocracy. This is from 1932, remember. Register on a continuous 24-hour per day basis the total net conversion of energy. In other words, monitor people so that they are basically not entitled to take out more than they put in. By means of the registration of energy converted and consumed, make possible a balanced load. Provide a continuous inventory of all production and consumption. Provide a specific registration of the type, kind, etc. of all goods and services where produced and where used. Provide specific registration of the consumption of each individual, plus a record and description of the individual. Right, let's go back 5 minutes before the break. Let's just go back to this one here. Provide a specific registration of the type, kind, etc. of all goods and services where produced and where used. Provide specific registration of the consumption of each individual, plus a record and description of the individual. You might have noticed that, by the way, this is very much related to smart meters. The detailed measurement of everything and everything that you consume in the house. But anybody here buy their clothes from Marks and Spencer's? Yeah, some? Some people buy clothes from Marks and Spencer's. Okay. If I buy clothes, I actually buy clothes from Marks and Spencer's because it's one of the few companies that actually provides trousers with the appropriate ratio of waist and leg length. Without me having to employ the services of a tailor. If I buy clothes in Marks and Spencer's, I will always use cash. Every single item of clothing sold in Marks and Spencer's is microchipped. For the purposes of stock control. It's so that obviously they can monitor with the barcoding when an item is sold, and obviously that logs into their database, they know when to order new stock. The problem is that when you buy items of clothing with a credit card or a debit card, that unique IP address that is linked to that item of clothing is from that point forward linked to you. So the next stage of this is to have receivers down the high street, and the computers will pick up, oh, here comes Ian Crane wearing a pair of pants that he bought in the Epsom branch, and you think, why the hell would anybody want to know that? Well, the reality is that no human would probably want or need to know that. But the artificial intelligence that is being created to monitor every single transaction wants to know that, because it wants to be able to predict everyone's behaviour. It's looking for patterns. It's looking for patterns where you may not even be aware that one exists. Anybody got loyalty cards? Anybody got a pair of scissors with them? You need to cut them up fast. You know, everyone's encouraged to get loyalty cards on the basis, oh, 5% saving, 10% saving. But every time you use a loyalty card, you are revealing yet more about your lifestyle, more about the patterns in your life. Every single transaction is being recorded. That's why they want to go to a cashless system. And actually, quite coincidentally, here's the lady who gave me this. This is from the, was it Preston Metro?
No, it was a Bradford Metro.
In Bradford Metro.
The other way, yeah.
Okay. It says, why carrying a credit card may soon be in vain. V-E-I-N. In vain. An expensive shopping trip need not cost an arm and a leg. Soon we could be paying with our veins. A payment system has been developed that scans a shopper's hand and then reveals the unique pattern in their blood vessels. Kickstar was invented by Frederick Leifdom, who insists the method is safer than credit cards. Right. You know what? When I worked for Schlumberger, the oilfield services company, we had a part of the company in France that actually Schlumberger invented the smart card, I hate to say that. And Schlumberger at one point was the largest producer of smart cards, and the French were way ahead of every other country because Schlumberger had its manufacturing facilities for these cards in France. Anyway, I had a meeting one day with the head of the smart card company at the European headquarters of Schlumberger in Montrouge, and the guy was waxing lyrical about, you know, what was coming, the next generation of the chip, the relationship to the thumbprint, or the eyeball, the iris. And I said, you've obviously never been to Brazil, have you? And I said, you know, you don't even have to be wearing a Rolex. That's one of the reasons, by the way, I never wear any jewellery. It's a hangover from my oilfield days. But if you're in parts of Latin America, and Africa, Nigeria in particular, and you have to be wearing anything, then that's fair game, because you have it, they don't. So they're going to take it off you. And if they find your wallet, and they find that there's credit cards that need a thumbprint or an iris scan, they're not just going to take your wallet, they're going to take your thumb and your eyeball. And the guy went, no. Cognitive dissonance. But this is where we're heading. This is where we're heading. And it's called gradualism. It's the process of gradualism. This is the report from Iron Mountain, a document that appeared in the public domain in 1967. If you can download this, you find it on the web. Just remember, report from Iron Mountain. It
attempted to be dismissed as a forgery. In reality, the think tank that produced this, one of the members had an attack of conscience in 1967 and worked with a journalist to try to recreate the original report. They might not be totally accurate, but it's as much as he remembers. Well, let me just share a quote with you from that report. It has been hotly argued that such a menace would offer the last best piece of hope by uniting mankind against the danger of destruction by creatures from other planets or from outer space. Experiments have been proposed to test the credibility of an out-of-world invasion threat. Nevertheless, an effective political substitute for war would require alternate enemies, some of which might seem equally far-fetched in the context of the current war system. One of the primary aspects of the report from Iron Mountain was looking for alternative threats to thermonuclear war to keep the population effectively in fear. Yeah. It goes on, it may be, for instance, that gross pollution of the environment can eventually replace the possibility of mass destruction by nuclear weapons as the principal apparent threat to the survival of the species. Yeah. Poisoning of the air and of the principal sources of food and water supply is already well advanced. This is 1963. And at first glance would seem promising in this respect. It constitutes a threat that can be dealt with only through social organisation and political power. But from the present indications, it will be a generation to a generation and a half before environmental pollution, however severe, will be sufficiently menacing on a global scale to offer a possible basis for a solution. This was effectively paraphrased by the Club of Rome in 1990, when they made the observation that by really pushing the environmental agenda, humanity becomes the enemy of itself. Yeah. And we can turn man against man. Yeah. Create the division. When we come back from the break, we're going to look at this guy, Zbigniew Brzezinski. This is Obama's mentor. And the book that he wrote in 1969, published in 1970, which takes the technocratic agenda to a whole new ballgame. Everything that this guy is writing about in 1969 is coming to pass. I don't claim special insight into what I present, I simply read the scripts. And I'm going to share with you this evening where those scripts are. I encourage you to read them because it's really, really important that we start to see what's happening and understand that unless we actually get up off our knees and we do find a way to respond to this, we will be condemning the next generation and the generations beyond to lives of unimaginable abject misery. I believe that we can do it. And actually I believe that what's going on with the fracking agenda, believe it or not, this may seem a hell of a leap, but I can assure you that by the end of the evening it will all fall into place. And I think what's going on with the fracking agenda is potentially the catalyst that gives us an opportunity to come together and shut these sociopaths down. So we're catching about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Okay. Hello? Get it? Sounds good, it's gone quiet. There we go. Okay, I was asked what time we're going to wrap. I'm going to try and finish this section by about 10:15. A lot to cover there. But so anybody who wants to leave or needs to leave at that time, obviously feel free, or before even. But then I'm quite happy to take a few questions after that. Zbigniew Brzezinski. Like I said, I don't claim any special insight. I simply read the scripts. I produced a DVD in 2008 called The War on Terror, The War on Earth, T-E-R-R-A. In that presentation, I made it very clear that once this guy pretty much threw Obama's hat into the ring, I knew that Obama was going to become the next president. I mean, it was just an absolute foregone conclusion. It was the same with Cameron. I knew that Gordon Brown was never, ever going to be elected as Prime Minister. He was simply given the opportunity to go into the chair to demonstrate to everybody that he was totally incapable of carrying out the globalists' agenda. I will give Gordon Brown a bit of credence. I actually think the guy's fundamentally a decent man.
Yeah.
And I think that, tragically, he spent all those years living next door to the arch socio-psychopath, and he still didn't really understand that the socio-psychopath had zero autonomy, because Blair is the consummate actor and was able to carry it off as though it was all coming from him, when of course it was just coming through him. Brown, I think, actually went into number 10 believing that he was going to have a degree of autonomy, a lot of autonomy, and of course he learned the hard way. This guy has been around in the US political arena, in the international political arena, basically ever since he wrote the book, Between Two Ages. This is my very well thumbed copy here. Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technocratic Era. If you try and get a hard copy of this book, they'll change hands for literally $200–300 a piece. But fortunately, it's available now on PDF. Again, it's an excellent book. It's not particularly thick, and it's not necessarily the easiest read, but it will shock you how much this guy is writing about in 1969 that is now coming into play. Let me just share a couple of extracts from that book with you. This is page 97. More directly linked to the impact of technology, it involves the gradual appearance of a more controlled and directed society. Now listen to this very, very carefully. Such a society would be dominated by an elite whose claim to political power would rest on allegedly superior scientific know-how. Unhindered by the restraints of traditional liberal values, this elite would not hesitate to achieve its political ends by using the latest modern techniques for influencing public behaviour and keeping society under close surveillance and control. 1969. And that's pretty much what is in place, of course, today. From page 11. As in the Technocratic society, the trend seems to be towards aggregating the individual support of millions of unorganised citizens who are easily within the reach of magnetic and attractive personalities, and effectively exploiting the latest communication techniques to manipulate emotions and control reason, which should be your final prompt to throw the TV out. I haven't watched TV, or I haven't had a TV, basically, since I came back to this country in 2001. We had one briefly, because my partner then wanted a TV, but that soon changed when we caught our 2-year-old, as he was at the time, watching SpongeBob SquarePants. And you know how absurd that program is, but he was literally sitting there in the alpha state. And that was it. That was the TV gone. And I haven't watched TV since. If anything is ever drawn to my attention, if anything specific is drawn to my attention, I can normally find it on YouTube or iPlayer. The TV was introduced in this country in 1953. That was the coronation. The coronation was the event that was used to push TVs into as many homes as possible in this country. In fact, I mean, the event was so catalytic in terms of getting the TVs into every house, or as many houses as they possibly could. They couldn't be produced. So what was happening, second-hand TVs were being picked up in the US and converted to the system here, and then sold at an affordable price here. And of course, today, there are people who have TVs in every damn room in the house. I'm not going to ask you to put your hand up if you do. Get rid of the damn thing. It's a control mechanism. Even if you're not really listening to it, or you claim you're not really watching it, it's the subliminals that are there. Well, the adverts, absolutely, especially with the kids, of course. It's conditioning. It's conditioning. It's creating the materialist. People who are going to literally be controlled by materialism. No matter how deeply disturbing the thought of using the environment to manipulate behaviour for national advantage to some, the technology permitting such use will very probably develop within the next few decades. And I did a couple of episodes of Humanity versus Insanity with a guy called David Lim, who is a former doctoral researcher into weather wars. And I will say no more, because if you want to... David Lim, in my opinion, is the most credible researcher in the sphere of geoengineering. And, of course, David absolutely came into his own, having predicted what would happen in the Somerset levels. Because, again, he'd read the scripts. So, you know, the flooding of the Somerset levels was absolutely deliberate.
Yeah.
You know, it was an agenda that was been put in place for some 15 years. Nothing is random. Final quote, well, actually this is The Crisis of Democracy by Crozier and Huntington. It said, the effects of this excess of democracy, if not fixed, are said to be an inability to maintain international trade, balanced budgets and hegemonic power in the world. The word hegemony effectively means control through the third party. And the third party is currently the national government. So this is effectively the globalist control. In reality, there is no such thing as an American nation. Right? Each state in the US has a phenomenal level of autonomy. And those states are beginning to realise that that autonomy is being stripped away from them. You know, the states have had their own national guard, which has effectively been used by the federal government as reservists in Iraq and Afghanistan. These national guards are now having some of their hardware, which they've purchased to protect the state, taken away. Because the federal government, i.e. the committee that works on behalf of the global banksters, is looking to destroy the autonomy of each state in the US, just as they are destroying the autonomy of the nation state in Europe. In 2007, I released a DVD called Codex Alimentarius, where I specifically addressed the agenda of abolition of all natural farming and the eradication of the natural health industry. In the introduction to that presentation, I talk about the agenda to literally bring about global governance. And I talk about the steps that they will take, the individual steps that they will take to achieve that. Stating back in 2007 that they were behind schedule. But they were looking to merge the US and the EU by 2015. That agenda is well on track, and the vast majority of people have absolutely no clue. It's something called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. The purpose of this is literally to subjugate nation states to the corporations. So in France, let me give you one example. In France, where on October the 11th last year, the highest constitutional court in France, the Conseil Constitutionnel, upheld the presidential ban on hydraulic fracturing. The presidential ban had been challenged by a Texan company called Studback. Studback claimed that they had purchased the license legitimately. They intended to explore and then to frack, just like Quadrilla here in the File Peninsula. But then Sarkozy had introduced the presidential ban on fracking. And then when Francois Hollande had been elected president, he upheld that ban, stating, and I quote, "The only thing that is proven about this industry is that it doesn't work in the way that the oil and gas industry claims." And in fact, he told Total, he said, "Don't even waste my time or yours trying to change my mind, because I've looked at the evidence." Well, Studback decided to challenge Hollande's ban in the courts. The court obviously looked at the evidence and they upheld the ban. The apologists for fracking in this country say, "Oh yeah, but that was the nuclear industry putting pressure on the court." The court looked at the evidence. Studback are waiting for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership to come into play so that they can then sue the French government for loss of lawful revenue. Loss of lawful revenue. In other words, what the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership will achieve is effectively the same level of corporatism that is in place in the US today, where the corporation has absolute superiority and priority over the citizen. The proof of this is in West Texas, where there are communities that haven't had water coming out of their taps now for nearly 9 months, because the gas industry is sucking the water out of the aquifers to frack. And when the communities have tried to take the gas industry to court, the courts have ruled in favour of the gas industry. The only thing that the gas industry is effectively required to do is to provide sufficient bottled water for the citizens so that they can basically live. But their livelihoods are shot because in many cases they rely on water for their agriculture. This is the corporatist state, the nth degree corporate state. If you're not on the corporate payroll in the US, then basically you're very much a second-class citizen. This level of corporatism is what they want to push right across the rest of the planet. And it's coming down the tracks at a phenomenal rate of knots. We've got the EU elections coming up, and I would absolutely implore you to look at which MEPs are, number one, anti-fracking, and number two, and only just number two, anti-Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Because anybody who is pro either of those is either not educated or is simply not operating in the best interest of the electorate, or of course worse, has had the photographs that were taken at some point shown to them and threatened to be released. So we do have a hell of a challenge. I mean, of that, there is absolutely no doubt. And you know where these attacks are coming from on multiple levels. Probably the most outrageous attack is through the vaccinations. Because this is what starts at such a young age. It's shutting down the capacity for independence, for sovereignty. Starts literally a few seconds after birth with the vitamin K vaccination. It was Rudolf Steiner, I think I've got the quote actually, Rudolf Steiner, over 100 years ago, said, a way will be found to vaccinate bodies so that these bodies will not allow the inclination towards spiritual ideas to develop, and all their lives people will believe only in the physical world they perceive with their senses. To keep people locked into physical, empirical materialism. He said this more than once in slightly different ways. He said, whatever is spiritual, whatever is of the spirit is nonsense, is madness. Endeavours to achieve this will be made by bringing out remedies to be administered by inoculation. Just as inoculations have been developed against protection against diseases, only these inoculations will influence the human body in a way that will make it refuse to give a home to the spiritual inclinations of the soul. People will be inoculated against the inclination to entertain spiritual ideas. This is called post-humanism. Post-humanism, or transhumanism. From the complete human and everything that that entails to the droid, to the drone. Like those guys in the yellow jackets that you saw at the start of the evening. Once they put that earpiece in their ear, they're drones. They're not thinking anymore. In fact, I've got to show you this. I had to stop and take this photograph when I was touring Ireland with the Irish part of the Fractured Future tour last year. This was on pretty much every bus stop in Ireland. Just look at this. Every vaccination is a little victory. For whom? A little victory for whom? Every vaccination is a victory for those who are trying to shut down the human spirit. And of course in the US, basically in many states, it is illegal not to have your child vaccinated. Many people move between the states so they can live in a state where they are not forced to have their child vaccinated. In California, it's now illegal to homeschool your child unless you possess a Californian teaching certificate And to get that teaching certificate, you have to agree that you will teach your child as per the Californian syllabus. You know, I mean, they will get you every damn which way. Just to show you, this is a statistic that even staggered me. This is the rise in autism in the US. 1980, so literally just 34 years ago, autism was 1 in 10,000. Look at it today. 1 in 50. 1 in 50. You know, Andrew Wakefield, of course, is vilified in the UK. He won't come into the UK. And if he does any talks, he'll do them elsewhere in Europe. He spoke in Ireland last year. And, of course, the Italians have actually upheld Wakefield's findings and stated that there is indeed a relationship between autism and... Then, of course, we have the big push of the pharmaceutical industry. You know, there is no money in health, but there's a shed load of money in sickness. You know, I mean, I'll tell you, to go and see a doctor, I've got to be dead. That's the only way I'm going to a doctor. Or if I do have to go to a doctor, it'll just be to see what they think, and then I'll, you know, maybe go away and do my own research. But you know, pharmaceuticals, do your own research. You know, there are occasions maybe where it's essential to take the drugs, but you know, we are becoming increasingly reliant on pharmaceuticals, which are being dished out by doctors who are little more than a front-of-house salesman for pharmaceutical companies. The incentives for doctors to push particular pharmaceuticals is becoming outrageous. Those doctors who have a conscience are leaving the profession, which is why, you know, those who remain in the profession are under increasing pressure. And then when it comes to our children, the drug that, unfortunately, and I've been talking about this now for 8 years, but the drug that is effectively undermining the youth of this country is Ritalin, kiddie coke, which is being dished out now in some schools, particularly in the city schools, like Smarties. This is a psychoactive drug. And if we look at the relationship between self-harming, suicides, violent crime and Ritalin, the evidence is very, very clear. If you want to take a look at this for yourself, all you've got to remember is SSRI. SSRI. SSRI stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, antidepressant. Ritalin is not technically an SSRI, but the effects on the developing brain are very, very different to the effects on the developed brain. There's a professor at Manchester University, a professor called John Harris, who 2 or 3 times a year manages to get articles in the press stating that Ritalin should be made freely available over the counter in all universities and colleges in this country because it enhances concentration. Sure it does, because the chemical signature of Ritalin is very, very similar to cocaine. But one of the things that the pharmacologists don't really understand is why this drug has such a marked difference in its effect on the developed brain and on the developing brain. Where on the developed brain, it acts like cocaine as a stimulant. On the developing brain, it acts as a depressant. There's a website, and all you've got to remember to search is SSRI database. SSRI database. Now this website, I don't think, has been maintained since the 11th of November 2011. And this was certainly the last time last screenshots I managed to get from it. This is a very comprehensive database, even though unfortunately it hasn't been maintained for nearly 3 years now. But you can search, once you find it, and you'll find it straight away, it'll be top of the list, SSRI database. You can change the searches on the database by simply clicking on, you know, the header there. Here you can see, I mean, I was doing it by date order. I was looking at the most recent. Here I was searching by England. And here you see the result: suicide, violence, standoff with police, suicide. That's called suicide by police, by the way. Suicide by police. In other words, deliberately putting yourself in harm's way. Suicide, violence, suicide, violence, suicide. You know, meds for depression, Prozac, blah, blah, blah. Here we go. This is the next generation from Ritalin in the US, an awful drug called Zoloft. And look at this. This is mainly the US, although a few cases elsewhere. Iraq was a US soldier. Murder, suicide, rampage shooting, murder, murder, suicide, 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 suicide. More US soldiers commit suicide after having returned from tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq than are actually killed in the arena, thanks to the drugs that are being pumped out. You know, we can help people by educating on this issue. You know, by getting people not to rush to get these drugs prescribed. One of the things that is really, really shocking is that if you have a child who is prescribed a Ritalin, you can actually get a carer's allowance. And unfortunately, on a lot of the estates around the country, word goes around like wildfire that if you get your child diagnosed as hyperactive, attention deficient, you get them on a course of Ritalin, you can claim a carer's allowance. 2 children on a diagnosed ADHD, and you can claim 2 carer's allowance. 3 children diagnosed ADHD, you can claim a super carer's allowance and be eligible to be provided by the state with a car, taxed, insured and fueled, because you have to look after 3. We have this crazy situation with these grants where word was getting around the council estates, and of course people were going, particularly single mothers, were going to doctors, getting the kids diagnosed, getting the allowances, and then not giving the kids the drugs. So now they've wisened up. Now they get the kids to do urine tests because they want the kids on this shit. I mean, it is what we're up against. This is absolutely horrendous. And then, of course, Ritalin, of course, is the nursery for the adult version, the Prozac. Yeah, mother's little helper. Once upon a time it was gin, now it's Prozac. It's estimated that some 3 million women are taking Prozac on a daily basis. The reason it's women, I asked a doctor friend of mine why it's women, and he said, Ian, when did you last go to a doctor? I said, no idea. He said, exactly. He said, exactly. He said, for a guy to go to the doctor, he really, really has to be sick. He said, but for a lot of women, you know, they have a much more, because of gynecology, etc., and birth, they have a much more relaxed relationship with the medical profession, generally. And he said, so, you know, they're not feeling too good, they go to the doctor, and the doctor says, oh, I've got just a thing. Prozac. But of course we're being attacked on other levels. This is the Codex Alimentarius agenda. GM food, agribusiness, natural farming is being destroyed. It already pretty much is destroyed in the US. And of course, natural medicines. And you know, when I was talking about this, when I released the DVD in 2007, a lot of natural health forums were targeted by the pharmaceutical industry, saying, oh, no, Crane's got it all wrong. He's just a conspiracy theorist. But, you know, people finally woke up when The Independent ran this article in December 2011, I think it was. December 2010 even. Europe to ban hundreds of herbal remedies. And the natural health industry went, oh! Because in May of 2011, that started the 2-year period by which all natural health products had to be registered. And if they weren't registered, then they would be illegal by 1st of May 2013. Guess who controls the only registered natural health products that are now legal in Europe? It's Big Pharma. And people say, oh, yeah, but you can still buy, you know, all this stuff. You can still buy St. John's Wort. Yeah, you can. Almost. You go into Holland and Barrett and you look at the bottles. Looks like the normal bottles, but on the back in microscopic print is equivalent. Equivalent. This is what we're up against. This is the legislation was known as thumped. The Traditional Herbal Medicines Products Directive, thumped. Unbelievable, isn't it? And still people don't know. Still people don't know. The other attack, of course, is the phones. You know, when I see kids in prams and pushchairs online playing Grand Auto Theft or whatever, I mean, it's outrageous. Outrageous. Yeah, once again, the developing brain is much more susceptible than the adult brain. But nonetheless, you're holding this RF transmitter to your ear for an increasing number of hours per day, and these phones are becoming stronger and stronger in the signal strength. Doesn't matter where you hold it. You know, especially at night. Especially at night. You know, how many people actually turn off their phones at night or put them on flight mode? All right, that's about 20% of you. You know, phones should be off at night. If you could switch the Wi-Fi off at night. Probably you're still going to get Wi-Fi from the neighbouring properties. I mean, you go to London and you look on how many Wi-Fi options you've got, and it's horrendous. You're like hundreds. I mean, at least in a sort of, you know, more rural area, you probably only have one or two. But switch it off. Watch the change in your sleep patterns. And of course, very controversial perhaps, but notice tonight, you know, the spraying over here tonight, you know, and the spraying is increasing at a phenomenal rate of knots, and yet it's the most visible and yet the most denied. You know, like I said, if you want to get an objective view on the geoengineering, look no further than David Lim, probably the most credible research I've ever come across on this particular issue. Fluoride in the water. You know, Ireland has had fluoride in the water for 30 odd years. It was the American military that advised the Irish government to put fluoride in the water. So consequently, it made it a lot easier to take the Irish nation off of the Irish people. I won't go into the detail for the time tonight, but Ireland should be the wealthiest nation in Europe. Sitting right on the western edge of Europe, of the EU, Ireland actually has 23% of the EU's territorial waters. Ireland should be providing the bulk of the fish to the EU. But corrupt Irish politicians sold 90% of that 23% for a one-off payment of €6 billion. Peter Sutherland, an Irishman by accident at birth, engineered the Irish economic meltdown, forcing mass emigration. Over 500,000 young Irishmen under the age of 35 have left the country since 2008. Most of those in the heart of the country, around the Leitrim area, right over the gaslands. Of course, the young people who stay behind are those that perhaps don't have the motivation necessary to get up and leave. And of course, those that leave are those that, you know, should be the ones you want to keep. We are facing enormous challenges, and that there is absolutely no doubt. You know, we are under mass attack. It is biospiritual warfare. The fracking agenda, it's no accident that it's global right now. The Crimea crisis, the Ukrainian crisis, has been specifically engineered, one, to try and initiate the global conflict that they tried to initiate in August last year with Syria. And let's bear in mind that the reason that we didn't go into World War III on August the 29th was because many people in this country did something they'd never ever done before. They got on the phone to their MP and said, you know what, I don't agree with this. And the vast majority of people who made an effort to contact their MP's offices were people saying, we don't agree with this, it's another illegal war. Yeah. At the end of the day, it came down to basically 13 MPs. There were 13 MPs. The difference was 13 between those who voted for and those against. It was 285 voting against, 272 voting for, a majority of 13. If just 7 MPs had voted differently, we would have gone into effectively the early rounds of World War III back in August last year. So that wasn't successful. So out come the warmongers again, Kerry and Haig, and they're now trying to do it in the Ukraine. A massive part of this is that the US has basically fracked the country into oblivion. All the shale fields in the US are now basically fully developed. In fact, in some cases, overdeveloped. The gas price in the US is sinking like a stone because of oversupply, and they're ready to export. So they need to create an export market. Meanwhile, Russia is developing its natural gas fields and has bountiful gas to export into Eastern Europe. So by manipulating this situation, and now manipulating the sanctions, that's why Kerry's doing the rounds, got to put sanctions on Putin and Russia, got to stop them bringing the gas into Eastern Europe. But where are we going to get the gas from? Oh, funny you should say that. We just happen to have boatloads of shale gas ready to export. The other factor, of course, look no further than Peter Brabeck, former chief executive officer of Nestlé, who in 2005 recorded an interview in which he stated that in his opinion, access to fresh water should not be regarded as a human right. That interview is freely available on YouTube. If you go to the Nestlé website, there are beaucoup de pages trying to claim that, oh, he was misquoted, he was taken out of context. No, he wasn't. He was very, very clear about what he was saying. Very clear. Access to fresh water should not be regarded as a human right. If you're not on the corporate payroll, you should not have access to the fundamentals of life. In Ireland, 20 years ago, if you'd have told anybody in Ireland that they would have to pay for their water, they laughed at you, because it's always been held that the provision of water is effectively a fundamental responsibility of the state. Plus, a lot of people in rural Ireland got their water from springs. The water companies in Ireland, many of which, like the UK, are foreign, they are going out and they are plugging the springs to prevent people from getting their water from any other source than the corporations. It's coming here. It's coming here. The reason that I said that the fracking agenda may be the catalyst that actually gives us an opportunity to really start to bring about some change is because the risk of 64% of this country being subjected to this abomination known as hydraulic fracturing means that vast tracts of this country are under threat. The majority of the population is under threat. In the US, 15 million people out of 300 million, 15 million people live within 1 mile of a fracked well. And if you spend any amount of time doing a bit of research, you will see the phenomenal, irrefutable evidence of the contamination of water, of soil, of air, and the negative health impacts. And one of the, in recent days, there was a court case in Texas where the Parr family were awarded $3 million in compensation because of the health impacts on that family. This was a jury case where the jury ruled 5-1 that the family had indeed suffered negative health impacts as a direct result of fracking. This may open the floodgates. There have been many, many other cases, and in many, many other cases, the industry effectively bribes the people just to shut up and keep quiet. In this country, this issue literally cuts right across the social, the political, the philosophical, and the religious spectrum. People are coming together from all sorts of backgrounds, united by the realization that if this industry kicks off in this country, we're in a world of hurt. And future generations basically will be left with a legacy that is unimaginable.
If there are any.
If there are any, indeed. So the fact that this is bringing people together, the fact that people are learning to respect that we may not actually agree on everything, but we do all agree on one thing. And what we have to do is focus on what we agree on and push to one side the things that we disagree on. The establishment are past masters at creating division and then driving the wedge into that division and literally fracturing the opposition. What we have to demonstrate is that we are bigger than that we can see through their Machiavellian games, and that regardless of how much they try to fracture the community, we will hold together. And when we defeat fracking in this country, and I believe we will, when we defeat fracking in this country, what I hope, what I visualise, is that we will realise the magnitude of that achievement. And we will take stock and we will say, see what we can achieve? See what we can achieve when we come together and we focus on what we agree upon. Now, what's the next issue we almost all agree upon? And then we knock them down. Domino effect, exactly. We're going to force a change in the political culture of this country. In fact, at AV5, we're going to put forward perhaps more than one potential political alternatives, viable, workable political alternatives, which at the very least can be an enormous thorn in the side of the establishment. We've got to get away from the controlled opposition, i.e. UKIP, set up as the controlled opposition. It shouldn't be any great surprise that every major Western country effectively has hung parliaments. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, UK, because obviously by creating a hung parliament, you don't give them sufficient mandate, and then they basically do whatever it is they have to do to stay in power. Didn't Nick Clegg say he wants to be Deputy Prime Minister till 2020? In other words, whatever it takes, he'll whore himself and his party just hold on to that power. But I really do believe we are bigger than that. And like I said, one of the things that really sometimes keeps me awake at night, I know the way these guys think, these sociopaths think. They need to tell us what they're doing. That's why these scripts are out there, so that they can claim, well, we told you, we did tell you, but you didn't react, you didn't respond, and apathy gave us a mandate. And this is what we've got to change. And we don't have to convert 100% of people, because the vast majority of people are never going to put down the sun or switch off their TV. And they're not going to get involved, one way or the other. We only perhaps need to reach about 5, 6, 7% of the population. And because hydraulic fracturing is going to impact on so many people, it's going to impact on the value of their property, it's going to impact on their ability to sell that property, it's going to impact on their ability to insure that property. What's it going to take? A whole area suffering from nosebleeds as a result of the flaring? Maybe that's what it is going to take. Maybe it is going to take, hopefully not too great a tragedy, to get the realisation. I hope not. I mean, I hope we have sufficient traction to be able to achieve a breakthrough before it gets to that. Look at what's happening right now as an opportunity. If everything is going tickety-boo, then we just truck along in a routine. We're not living, we're existing. It's only when shit happens, and we have to deal with that, that we then are forced to actually start to experience life. We're here for 28,000 days, give or take. 28,000 days. Much of that time is spent acclimatizing. It's called childhood and youth, young adulthood. And at some point, we have an opportunity to take stock, to reflect, and say, okay, one, what am I learning out of this university in this third dimensional realm? And two, maybe what can I contribute? Or do we just go through 28,000 days and exist? Well, many will. Many will just exist, and that's fine. But the good news is that more and more and more people, not only do they want to live and experience life and everything that entails, but more importantly, they want their children to live and their grandchildren to live. Yeah. And to be able to have an environment where they can be nurtured, rather than living lives of absolute misery, an environment where they're living on cardboard food, drinking contaminated water, and are effectively corporate slaves. Fundamentally, the choice is ours. I know it may seem perverse, but I'm actually really excited by this time. You know, the speed at which people are waking up, the speed at which people are realizing that there is something other than the treadmill. It's very painful, it's very difficult to step off that treadmill, and maybe you don't have to step all the way off. Maybe it's not possible to step all the way off in some cases. But once you actually take a step off the treadmill and find that there are other ways of living other than the salary. 20 years ago, I had no concept of life without a salary. Today, I have no concept of life with a salary. I can never go back to that, ever. So, I'm sowing seeds, and that's all we can do. Sow the seeds. Don't preach. Sow the seed. Encourage people to do their own research. There's nothing I've shared with you tonight that you can't find out for yourself. All the documentation I refer to is freely available for people to find for themselves. But you know what? You actually have to look for it. And that's what these socio-psychopaths rely on. That people, even if they are motivated to look for it, they won't have the time. Because they're running on that treadmill, desperately trying to keep a roof over their head and food on the table. So you guys in this area, by the way, I mean, I've said that I think the fracking issue is the catalyst. And I mean, it's great to see Bob and Ebony and Gazer, at the very least, there's probably others around the room, Dave, who have made a tremendous effort over the last few years to raise awareness of this issue around the Fylde Peninsula. So much so that Quadrilla really have no idea of the magnitude of the opposition, and it's growing all the time. And it's not only bringing communities together, it's bringing the wider community of the Fylde together. Yeah, absolutely. Listen, it's been just over a year, it's been more than a year since I last spoke at New Horizons. Hopefully it's not a year before I come back. I think by the end of this year, we are going to be in a different ballgame. I mean, I think what's happening is happening at an increasing rate of knots. And hopefully, next time I come back, you know, we really are on a roll and we're excited about that roll. And we can see that things are happening so much so that the hustings for the next election take on a completely different mantle. Yeah. Yeah? Thank you for sharing the evening with me. Thanks a lot. Can you speak up? So that I'll repeat the question anyway.
Yeah, sure. You know the election's coming up, and most people don't bother voting.
Yes.
Don't bother going. I've always voted either for the Green Party or I've gone and destroyed the ballot paper. Does that count for a vote? So if
No.
you say X amount of the ballot papers are destroyed.
It's a spoiled vote, and that's all that matters.
Does that not show that apathy is better to go out rather than
It's better to go and vote. I mean, you know, in the past, I would have argued that, you know, why bother voting? Now, I think it's absolutely essential that we engage in the political process. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about at AB5 is an initiative that is actually going to provide, I think, a very unique alternative on the ballot paper. But more of that at AB5 because, you know, we don't want to go too fast on that one. But it is important to engage. There was a by-election just across the Manchester Ship Canal from where we were camping at Barton Moss a few weeks ago, at Wythenshawe. The number of people on the electoral roll who voted was 27%.
Is that the one that Beth studied? Is that the one that...
I don't know who the... But what I meant was 73% of people didn't vote in a by-election. 73%. In other words, you've only got to get half of that 73% who didn't vote to be motivated to vote the same way, and you can literally blow that out of the water. It's really important to vote.
Who do you vote for?
Well, that's... Listen, in the coming elections, the two critical issues, particularly in the European elections, are fracking and transatlantic trade and investment partnership. That's the two critical issues. And you won't find these debated in the media. You may not remember, and I think I actually talked about this 4 years ago when I was here. The MP's expenses scandal was deliberately contrived to shut down all debate about the forthcoming EU elections. So the whole idea was to stop the debate because at that time it was becoming increasingly evident that more and more of UK independence was being handed over to Brussels. And so to keep that debate out of the media, the expenses scandal, the groundwork of which had taken some 13 years to prepare, but it was like storing up your ace, and then when you're ready to play it, play it. And that's exactly what it did. It took all debate about the EU off the media. And we're probably going to see the same here in the coming weeks, because the focus is going to be on Crimea and the Ukraine and not Europe. But let's work around that. But then I hope that by the next general election, there is a very real alternative.
So at the minute you tell people to look for the candidates that are against fracking and against that.
Yes. Yeah, TTIP.
But you have to vote.
Yes. Oh, you must vote.
Do they not change the mind when they get in?
Well, that's also, you've got to hold their feet to the fire. I mean, this is what we're finding with the politicians on the fracking, because every single politician says, yeah, well, I'm against fracking in my constituency, and I will do everything I can to keep fracking out of my constituency, but I still support the overall agenda. And you can see that, ultimately, I mean, Barbara Keeley, the MP for Earlham and Eccles that covers Barton Moss, I mean, she's been very consistent in her opposition to fracking, but does anybody care? No. But yeah, at least you can start, hold their feet to the fire, and then if they change their mind, then, in a year's time, we've got the opportunity again in the national election. Absolutely. We must participate. Yes. Yeah. I hate to say it, because, it's easier to say I'm just not going to play your game, but it's time for us to play their game. Actually, it's time for us to change the rules.
Yeah.
Yeah, to our rules.
Vote for an independent.
So,
you mentioned skull and crossbones and decapper, etc. What's the role of common purpose, and how are they developing along?
That's a very good question. The reality is, in this country, we do not have, or did not have, the equivalent of Phi Beta Kappa. Because Phi Beta Kappa, which is actually older than Skull and Bones, Phi Beta Kappa was actually established on December the 5th, December the 5th, I think it was 1776. But Phi Beta Kappa is the oldest fraternity in the US. And like I said, it covers all the rest of the Ivy League universities. Because in this country, we didn't have anything that covered the other universities. We were so focused on Oxford and Cambridge. But obviously, there were people coming through the other ranks, and Common Purpose was established in 1988 to effectively fill in that gap that we have in this country. And for those of you who are not familiar with Common Purpose, I'm sure everybody in the room is familiar with Common Purpose, yeah? Yeah. Okay, well, the first 3 episodes I did of Humanity versus Insanity, I did with Brian Gerrish, and we focused on the role of Common Purpose with particular attention on the police, and even more specific attention on the Greater Manchester Police. But this is a very, very pernicious organisation, and of course now they're recruiting in the schools. They are looking to identify the young leaders and effectively, indoctrinate them. What she presents is an outstanding hypothesis. And, I think, look, we have to practice epistemological integrity. And that is that unless something is absolutely proven, it remains a possibility. And what Dr. Judy Wood has put out there is certainly a possibility, a tangible possibility. So, the only people who know exactly what occurred on 9/11 are those who perpetrated it. I think, the critical element is that 9/11, the London bombings, in Spain it's the Madrid bombings, in India it's the Mumbai bombings, but, these are trigger events. These are events that actually, in many cases, are the catalyst that gets people to consider the possibility that their worldview might not be correct. In my case, it was Kuwait. That was the catalyst for me, that was the trigger for me, and then 9/11 was the accelerator, if you like. But, there's no defined script. People come to this in different ways, and I think the important thing is not to get too bogged down in any one particular issue, but, it's important to actually look at the spectrum and recognise the pieces of the jigsaw, but ultimately the critical thing is obviously to start to put together the bigger picture. Because once you start to put together the bigger picture, you can then interpret the events that are unfolding on a daily basis. So that, right now we've got a significant chunk of the country buying into all the bullshit about Crimea and the Ukraine, and what a nasty tyrant Putin is. And how absurd is it that the US are telling Putin that he's got to get all his military behind his own borders? It's unbelievable, isn't it? Okay, well, 2 more, Darren, Vanessa.
Here's a good one. Who's right at the top? Who or what's right at the top?
That's a very good question. When you find out, let me know.
In your opinion?
I have no idea.
Okay.
No, and listen, I think, by the way, I'm going to tell you that the most seminal work on planet or off, very, very good question. The seminal work on that, for a lot of people, I think is Committee of 300, Dr. John Coleman. He wrote the book originally in 1986, he updated it in 2006. I certainly don't necessarily agree with everything that John Coleman writes, but I think it's a very good start point for people to actually have some comprehension from an academic as to how that pyramid is structured and who participates in it. And then, once you go from Committee of 300, then David Rothkopf's Superclass. And then if you're really feeling like a bit of academic work, Tragedy and Hope. And of course, Tragedy and Hope was Clinton's Bible. But Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley is absolutely essential reading. I mean, Carol Quigley actually believes that the sort of one world government is a good idea, but he doesn't actually think, or didn't think, that the way they were going about it was necessarily. Listen, I mean, there's a lot of police with boots on the ground who actually want to embrace G4S. They think it's going to be a good thing for them, individually. But yes, I think some of the senior police officers who have retained the capacity for independent thought are starting to see that this might actually be a major step down the slippery slope to the corporatism. Because you only got to look at the corruption of G4S, particularly in terms of managing things like the prison service and probation systems, billing the country for probationers that didn't exist, and so on and so forth. Listen, once you put the priority on profit, once you tie somebody's salary and bonuses to profit, then people will do whatever it takes. And that's unfortunately the way it's heading right now. I think we've got to stop there, because it is 10:35, so I can talk afterwards, but thank you so much for...